And I previously discussed, we have the Smart Portal link where you submit work notification forms. And we have the Structure and Bridge Division webpage with INIM 95. We have the priority score, again, the documentation that, as well as the smart flags. We got the local assistance webpage with the previous presentation on the Smart Portal, and then the Asset Management Division webpage showing the eligible structure lists. So moving ahead, again, the required documents, again, we have the 3 cross-sections that we're looking for. Again, these are very simple sketches. We'll see that in a moment. And then the concept site plan, I'll go over that as well as the smart flags. So in addition to that, we have the project cost estimates. The deliverable requirements are a PCS or equivalent cost estimate. And we actually you need to submit 2 estimates. One is for the repair scope, and the other one is for the bridge replacement scope, both of them compliant with state of good repair. Now, if your repair scope is to replace the bridge, then you only obviously need to submit 1 estimate. But if you have actual repairs being done to the bridge, we will need 2 scopes. These are used to establish your project allocations or your budget. That's a function of your fund need is the repair cost estimate less any other local funds that are brought to the project. And then it's then used in the prioritization process for selecting projects. Moving to the concept site plan, this is one example that we're giving here of what it might look like. You'd have an aerial background. You can use GIS mapping for the contours, right-of-way, and utilities. Some locality GIS information will have floodplain information and all sorts of other information in addition to that. We would like to see the concept details, the location of the bridge, the approach work, any fill impacts. For bridges that are a simple replacement with either the bridge is closed during construction or MOT with 1 lane, those end up being fairly simple. But if you start getting into offset alignments and significant grade raises, that's where these types of site plans might get more involved, and that will help with the estimating process. And this is just a blow-up of the image in the previous one. Again, a very small amount of line work focusing on the limits of the project, the layout of where the bridge will be situated, perhaps some toe of slope lines to see if there's any impacts on right-of-way. If this was in an urban area, you'd have some houses and more right-of-way limits from the various houses, and you'd get to be able to get a much better impact of any impacts on houses or residential or commercial properties, whatnot. Also on this, the GIS pulled in the utility information from the GIS mapping, and if you completed a site visit and noticed some additional utilities, it would be good to indicate that information as well. Here's a page, I'm not going to go over this, but this is a page on guidance on how to get GIS mapping from the VDOT Virginia Base Map Program site. And you could follow these steps. If you run into any problems, give us a call. Also, many localities, counties and cities will also have their own GIS mapping site as well, and that information can be used as well. Just moving over to the typical approach roadway section. Again, this is what it looks like. Again, we're looking for very limited information. We're really interested in the geometrics, the width of the platform, some slope lines and so on, just getting a basic understanding of what the existing cross-section on the immediate approach to the bridge looks like. And then we want the cross-section of the existing bridge. This can simply be taken from the existing plans. A PDF be made, and you cut that section out of the PDF, put it on a sketch, submit it, and that's all we're after. And then finally, it's the proposed deck section. In here, we're more interested in the section geometry on the bridge as opposed to the structural details. We want to see what you're coming back with in terms of your bridge width, the laneage, the shoulders, so that we can compare that to existing and make sure it's complying with the INIM. And then these documents can be uploaded in Smart Portal. This has always existed as the attachments to be uploaded. You've got the supporting documentation for the smart flags, the cost estimate, and the various sketches that are to be submitted. So again, those should be uploaded in Smart Portal. I'm going to move into some lessons learned on previous applications. We've done a couple of rounds of VDOT and 2 rounds of localities, and just want to go over some challenging areas. Whenever an application has a co-application for Smart Scale, those should be discussed early with the district offices. Those are more challenging to determine which program is funding it, the eligibility of the scope, and so on. Their Smart Scale is certainly one, but there's also other funds with specific scope requirements. There's container funds, there's HSIP, and so on. If you're looking at any of those fund types, please discuss it early with your district. The final one here is if the locality, for example, wanted to bring funding to add in a turn lane on a bridge or something like that, the addition of capacity is not eligible for state of good repair, but that doesn't stop the locality from bringing money and covering those elements. Again, that's something we'd want to review in detail with you as well. We don't want the work notification for state of good repair to be rejected, nor in the other program that you may be applying for. So please coordinate early on those. The next ones are areas that have resulted in insufficient allocations, and the scope was creeping on the project. So if you're exceeding the SGR limits as specified in the INIM, when you read that, some of those require district structure and bridge engineer or assistant state structure and bridge engineer approval. We've had examples where a bridge is crossing over a railroad, and the grade raised 3 or 4 feet at the bridge, and it resulted in several thousand feet of approach work. Just to raise the grade for other issues probably wouldn't be approved for state of good repair, but because the railroad forced the profile increase, it was covered. But those items needed early approval and coordination with the district and even central office. These other items down here, the bike ped, the railroad, the complex environmental permits, any navigation clearances, or future expansion. Again, these are elements that are a little more complicated in terms of ensuring they'll be covered by the program, and are often associated with scope creep or cost increases on the estimates. So again, if we could coordinate early with those aspects as well. And then finally, moving into maybe more routine issues, but still they've been a challenge on some applications, is the maintenance of traffic. We've had projects where it was assumed the road could be closed, and after doing some work on the project, it turned out that we had to keep one lane, for example, open on the bridge and shift to part width construction. That adds MOT bid items, access issues, double mobilization issues. It can add 20–30% to the project cost. Same thing, we've had projects with part width construction assumed, and then we were forced to go to an offset alignment. Again, that starts picking up temporary and permanent right-of-way and utility impact. So just reviewing that MOT concept early on is essential to getting an estimate right. Utility impacts always seem to be underestimated, and right-of-way costs always seem to be underestimated. We've seen right-of-way partial takes become full takes, or just underestimating the right-of-way costs. Always include inflation with the right-of-way costs, and I'll cover that a little bit more later on. And then finally, the schedule. If you assume an aggressive schedule, and then later on we get a 2-year delay, that incurs inflation costs. That could be anywhere from 3 to 9%, depending on the project and whatnot. So Again, be mindful of the schedule and make sure you've included the inflation costs as well. And on all of those items I previously discussed, if you could provide those details in the work notification form in Smart Portal, there's an area for a detailed project description. Again, coordinate early with your district, and then please include information on those aspects in the detailed project description. It helps us review it, and it helps us help you. Now, these slides and moving forward, these are considered best practices based on some recent lessons learned. So the requirements on the following slides are not required, but it is the direction VDOT is moving right now. Actually, and it's a result of some major estimate increases on several projects that we've seen in the last couple of years. So the former chief engineer, and this has been endorsed by the current chief engineer of VDOT, he set up a project estimating task group in May of this year. And there's two things under development coming out soon. One is a pre-scoping summary form, and the second one is a project cost estimate summary form for all project phases. For state of good repair, these are strongly recommended, not required. However, I understand in Smart Scale, they'll likely be required in future rounds as well as other programs. So again, for state of good repair this round, strongly recommended. We're a little bit ahead of the curve in our process, but in future rounds, it'll probably become required like other programs. So this is covering the pre-scoping summary form, and I just want to show that it's a very simple form where you fill in text boxes for various scope elements of the project. So we basically want, like I was mentioning earlier, it's good to have a little bit of details of each scope element. So as you go through those various scope elements, you put in some verbiage with a focus on any assumptions you've made, any items that have a moderate to high risk, as well as unknowns. Those are the types of things we need to be focusing on. And now, not all of these subcomponents or elements of the scope are going to be applicable to this form. So if you don't have a bridge over a railroad or transit, you simply hit not applicable in the form. Now, just going back to the topic areas, we've broken it down to these 20 some odd areas. So we would, if you were to use this form, we would expect a little bit of text with each of these boxes or with each of these items to describe relevant things for that project. And there'll be guidance as well on each of these areas when it's ultimately published here. It'll probably have a draft out in 2 weeks and a final in about a month, but there'll be a little bit of verbiage associated with each of these items as to what should be reviewed during pre-scoping. So again, just some examples after the presentation. You could go through and take a look at these and just get a feel for the type of information that would be placed here. Again, this all helps you develop a better estimate for the project and get the right amount of funding. Another form that's under development is the project cost estimating summary. It looks a little ominous, but really it serves as a checklist. Basically, we're going through the project and encouraging you to make sure the various boxes are filled out if you have the scope component on the project. It's broken into 3 phases: preliminary engineering, right-of-way, and construction. Again, for now, the only requirement is to submit a PCS estimate or equivalent. This form simply serves as a summary from that. It's being developed by the Project Management Office, and training and guidance is also being developed, and it covers all phases. Just going into a little bit more detail on this, it has 3 basic aspects of costs. You have the base cost, the contingency, and the inflation. The base cost is the 50th percentile cost. It's what you think the project is going to cost with everything considered, including incidentals and so on. Then you put in a contingency cost for possible overages. That's based on project development and risk. If you're early in the project development and it's a high-risk project, the contingency should be high. If you're late in the project development and the risk is low, your contingency is low. And I understand the PMO office is going to give recommended contingencies as well to be used. Also, inflation is included. There's an area down here that considers the inflation on the project to be explicitly input as a bottom line number. And then finally, VDOT oversight costs. These are the lap manual costs. We've seen some applications where these costs have been missed. And again, we're kind of putting a bottom line number here for those costs to be included as well. This is generally how the three components of the form will look like, but just to go, these are my last three slides. For the PE phase, again, we've broken up the disciplines that are typically on any project. You have the contingency percentage and costs that'll get picked up here, the VDOT oversight, and the inflation. We're just making sure all the costs associated with the project and for each discipline are covered. Right-of-way is three disciplines identified. It's right-of-way itself, out-of-plan utilities, as well as railroad. Again, just picking up the VDOT oversight, the inflation, and the contingency, making sure those are covered in the right-of-way phase as well. And then finally, and this is my last slide, is the construction phase. Again, we've broken up the bid items by discipline, but many people don't know the 6 additional items that are required in the estimate for the construction phase. Those obviously are picked up when an estimate's going towards award or advertisement, but at preliminary engineering, many people aren't thinking about these costs. And we got to capture them early on, along with the contingency and inflation associated with those. And these, again, are construction engineering inspection, railroad, if you should have one, incidental for claims and work orders. That usually runs between 5 and 10%. Contract requirements, those are for the incentive disincentives. VDOT allows up to 5%. And then if there's any state forces and state police, I'm not expecting much on these. But anyway, again, you pick up the VDOT oversight in the construction engineering. You have the inflation factor and the contingency. Again, just trying to pick up all of the costs that are associated with projects so that when we arrive at the end, hopefully we have the right budget for the project. So that's it on the presentation. We'll open it up here for questions in a sec, but again, I'm going to encourage early coordination with your district. Don't leave your work notification to the last week. We've had problems in the past where it's submitted on the last day and we're getting technical difficulties or whatnot. So at this point, I'll open it up.
Any questions? You can use the chat feature or you can unmute your phone. Any questions on the bridge before we move on to pavement? All right, we're not seeing any.
Oh, thank you.
All right, well, anytime during the presentation, if you think of a question, just go ahead and type it in the chat field. All right. With that, we're going to go ahead and switch gears and talk about the State of Good Repair local paving program and federalization of that program. And to kick us off, we're going to start with Bob Booth from VDOT's Asset Management Division to kind of give a quick overview of the program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, as Todd said, my name is Bob Booth. I'm the program manager for SGR for the Asset Management Division here at VDOT. I've been asked to give you a little bit of an overview of the program. In 2015, the General Assembly set aside 45% of our construction funds specifically for SGR. And that was the purpose of that was to dedicate some funding to reconstruct and rehabilitate our deteriorated pavements, as well as to reconstruct and replace structurally deficient bridges. And for the pavements, that is going to be addressing our interstate primary and primary extensions, and for bridges, all bridges on the NBI system. Further, the Code of Virginia, Section 33.2-369, further elaborated how we would prioritize selection of projects based on pavement segments and bridges that were eligible, based on, for pavements, mileage, the condition of the pavement, and the anticipated cost associated with reconstructing or rehabilitating that pavement. For bridges, was based on the number of bridges, their condition, and again, the cost associated with reconstructing or replacing those bridges. Each even-numbered year, the Commonwealth Transportation Board was tasked with establishing percentages for distribution to each of our 9 construction districts. There was a base of 5.5% minimum established, with a cap of 17.5% each year. And again, that's updated every even-numbered year by November by the Commonwealth Transportation Board, and that is based on the needs established in the Commissioner's annual report. The code did provide for 2 waivers that the CTB could enact. The first was in any particular year, if there was an extraordinary circumstance with regarding one of our pavement areas or structures, we could exceed an allocation to one of our 9 construction districts, exceed that 17.5% per year for any year. Additionally, if our secondary system would be deteriorated, they have an opportunity to allocate 20% of the SGR funds to the secondary pavements. Additionally, the code established 3 test requirements for application of SGR funds. The first for the pavements, that it must improve the pavement condition to fair or better state. It also needs to meet the definition of pavement rehabilitation or reconstruction established by the Federal Highway Administration in their September 2005 memo, which we've attached a link there, and additional clarification in February of 2016. For bridges, it must remove the bridge from the structurally deficient status. It also needs to meet the definition of bridge rehabilitation and replacement established by the Federal Highway Administration's Bridge Preservation Guide, initially dated August 2011, and the link that we provided will actually give you a link to the update that was updated spring of 2018. So once the SGR program is distributed to each construction district, it is then further subdivided into the various types of SGR assets, whether they're VDOT pavements, VDOT bridges, local pavements, or local bridges. And that's how the funds are set aside for work on SGR assets. I'm going to now turn it over to Yolanda to elaborate on the primary extensions.
Good afternoon. My name is Yolanda Newton. I work in Local Assistance Division. I'll give an update to paving, primary extension paving. So the current primary extension policy was adopted by the CTB in June 2014 and became effective July 1st, 2015. The policy currently allows localities to apply for a maximum of $1 million per year per locality for segments that have a CCI rating of less than 60. Under the current policy, these segments or projects must be advertised within 6 months of receipt of allocations. In addition, localities are required to acknowledge any funding received, supplements, not replaces their current level of funding by checking the maintenance of effort certification box in the SMART portal. When the primary extension program began, segments selected were funded with CTB formula set-aside funds, and segments selected for funding received an exception to the federal process. Beginning in 2017, state of good repair funds were applied to the projects in addition to the CTB formula set-aside. The combined allocations available from the two programs has been approximately $15 million per year. In FY 2021, the CTB formula funds will sunset, and the State of Good Repair funds are anticipated to be fully implemented. So also beginning in fiscal year 2021, primary extension segments will be required to follow the federal process, and the VDOT Commissioner granted an exception to the federal process through fiscal year 2020 to allow localities time to prepare for federal requirements. So VDOT recognizes that additional time and cost will be required to follow the federal process. Additional cost for projects to meet federal requirements includes contract development items such as safety reviews, environmental studies, and NEPA requirements, and contract administration costs such as contract enforcement, and items such as Buy America, DBE goals, and Davis-Bacon wage rates. There will also be additional costs for VDOT oversight and additional time to meet federal requirements and obtain federal authorization. Asset management, local assistance, maintenance, construction, and environmental divisions met with a local government working group to receive recommendations and concerns regarding federalizing the primary extension program. From the working group's recommendations, the various VDOT divisions continue to work to identify ways to streamline the process for localities. As you'll see in the coming slides, we will be able to identify several streamlining opportunities. So I'm going to move on with the first streamlining opportunity that we've identified. So VDOT Environmental already has a streamlined process in place for VDOT paving projects that's been approved by FHWA. This streamlined process allows for efficiencies with other state agencies that review federally funded projects. For example, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Department of Environmental Quality. And localities do not have this efficiencies that VDOT has, so these agencies, so VDOT Environmental Division is offering to assist localities with completing the NEPA document and threatened endangered species clearances for the primary extension projects, similar to the streamlining process already used for TAP projects. So the streamlined process includes a one-time programmatic categorical exclusion for paving projects. Programmatic agreements have been executed with the resource agencies for threatened and endangered species coordination. Localities do not have the efficiency, so this will be a great benefit because the cost will be reduced. Localities may be required to obtain permits and to include special provisions in contract documents depending on the location of the project and clearances received. A special provision template language will be provided when required. NEPA document is now required due to federal funds being applied to the project. All activities in the contract become federalized, and all activities must be included in the NEPA document. Example one side of the road receives federal SGR funds. The other side of the road is in the same contract and paid for with locality funds. Since both sides of the road are in the same contract, both sides of the road are federalized and are included in the NEPA document. Example 2, a roadway receives federal SGR funds to pave a portion of the roadway. The locality wants to build a turn lane in the same area as the paving project, and the locality decides it would be best to include both activities in the same contract. Both activities would be considered federalized, and the project will no longer qualify for the streamlined clearance process. A one-time programmatic categorical exclusion could not be used, and threatened and endangered species programmatic agreement is no longer applicable. That's all for the environmental update. Does anybody have questions regarding that? You can either communicate in the chat or unmute your line.
Yeah, if there was a question in the chat in regards to localities, VDOT charging to the project, answer that question, yes. VDOT will be charging to your project for not only VDOT oversight, but if we do complete the NEPA on your behalf. So you need to make sure you work with your local liaison to incorporate those activities. So in future applications, we'll actually include in the SMART portal a way for you to indicate whether or not you want VDOT to do the NEPA document or not. But for this cycle, if you just coordinate with your local liaison, that would be early on, prior to submitting your application, that would be beneficial.
All right, the next thing we're going to go over is the actual contract administration component of, and that could be anything from the procurement and or administration of the actual work to be done. We, as had been indicated, we worked with internally and with some external stakeholders as well to identify opportunities to help either bridge the gap or provide another outlet as it pertains to federalizing these paving contracts. The first thing that we came up with was to actually provide a federal paving kind of template, Section 100 documents that you'd need to utilize, as we talked about, the Davis-Bacon wage rates and all the federal provisions that are required for a federal aid contract. So we are in the process of developing that. I mean, it's the same thing that we currently use for almost all of our paving contracts. The next option would be for VDOT to actually advertise and administer the contract on behalf of the locality, knowing some of the constraints with maybe it being very small segments and there not being a cost to benefit from the perspective of procuring a contract for a very small segment. So that would be one option, and depending on the size of the district, we really would need to wait to see what that looks like and how many want to participate in that type of approach. If it was a district that had a large urban cross-section, if you will, then it may be just an on-call state of good repair, primary extension paving contract for us to utilize on y'all's behalf. And then the other option would be just to package it with our existing maintenance schedule contracts that we do annually. The other option would be for the localities to federalize one of your existing contracts. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I know it comes with some strings there, and you're tying now the federal provisions to other segments that really don't account. We've been in discussions with FHWA around some flexibility when it came to that. I don't know that we have made a lot of headway, but they were willing to entertain the discussion at least from that perspective, but there'll hopefully be more to come from that. And then the other option we had been presented with when we met with stakeholders was the potential for localities to use an existing contract, maybe an on-call IDIQ type contract that maybe you already have on the books. And that came up when we met with the stakeholders group, and that is definitely a viable option, assuming that contract was procured with the federal provisions that come with those federal monies. So that kind of covers I will just hit the obvious. We were talking about the last question before I got started about cost. We're about 6% for contracted admin on the back in for construction cost, and that is based on my understanding in previous conversations. That's billable to the project. It's a project expense, but it is about 6% on our side to actually administer the construction of the contract. I don't know how, anybody have any questions, concerns, comments?
Yeah, we'll definitely open up the questions. That was Harold Caples from our construction division. Looks like we do have a question for you, Harold, from the chat box. How can we federalize an existing contract if it wasn't procured that way?
You can. It has to be, you have to come out the gate, because just from the perspective of procurement, those provisions need to be in there when the contractor's actually initially seeing it and submitting their initial bid. It's not something as simple as, you know, it's not as simple as if you had a federal contract and maybe you had wage rates, but you didn't have a specific wage rate. You can add that after the fact because you procured it initially with the federal provisions. But in this instance, if it wasn't procured out the gates that way, but here again, we have some time because this is, you know, you could be looking to the future in that regard. So maybe this coming fall or winter or springtime, be looking to get a federal provision contract out there.
Looks like there's a follow-up to that question, asking about bullet number 3, asking whether or not, does that mean something different?
Isn't that they could take
No, one of your existing contracts, if you have, let's say your locality and you have 3 resurfacing contracts, maybe you do one plant mix and one slurry and one latex contract. If you took your paving contract while you were developing it and procured it as a federal contract, then these routes could be added even at a later date to it. But it would have to be procured, so it's essentially taking the thought here, and maybe it's not worded exactly the way, I mean, I clearly see where you're coming from, whoever's asking the question. Really what we're saying is if you're already procuring federal or paving contracts, but typically they're not federalized, you would need to flip the switch on at least one of those contracts when you procure it and make it a federal aid contract.
Great. Any other questions for Harold? All right, we're not seeing any additional questions in the chat feature, so we'll continue on. Again, if you have questions as we go through, just go ahead and include them in the chat box. Folks will stick around. All right, so next up we have Tanvir Chowdhury from our maintenance division. He's going to talk to you a little bit about the safety analysis that's required on federalized paving projects.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanvir Chowdhury. I'm with Maintenance Division. The next couple of slides, I'm going to try to briefly touch on the safety analysis that's required for these federal paving projects. And in the next slide, you will have a link to the VDOT FHWA's Stewardship and Oversight Agreement, and we have placed a link in the presentation. You can access that document and look at some of the detailed requirements. I intentionally stayed away from some of the details because it requires some getting into some of the details that I don't think is appropriate for a 2 or 3 slide presentation here. So I'm just going to try to go over some of the highlights of the state-funded projects versus the difference between some of the state-funded projects and the federal-funded projects. And again, for the vast majority of the projects for which we have seen applications in the past and hopefully going forward as well, are going to fall into the Tier 1 or Category 1 project, which FHWA and VDOT sort of looks at what we call preservation projects. And by preservation projects, simply stating, these are not really changing the existing elevation of the pavement by more than 1.5 to 2 inches. So in other words, these are your typical chip sale, slurry, latex projects, which will have limited changes in elevation, or your inch-and-a-half mill and fill type projects, which is not going to result in a net elevation change of more than 2 inches. In the past, for state-funded projects, the general highway safety analysis was only recommended for the state-funded projects, but if it is developed as a federally funded or federally eligible project, then a general highway safety analysis is required for this project. However, a detailed guardrail assessment is not required for the Category 1 projects. The biggest difference between the Category 1 projects and the Category 2 projects, the Category 2 project obviously are the ones where the pavement surface or the final surface results in a net change in elevation of more than 2 inches, which FHWA categorizes as 3R projects. In that situation, a more detailed general highway safety analysis is required, and in some places, some site-specific safety analysis is also going to be required. And in addition to that, a detailed guardrail assessment is also required for those types of projects. But just to remind you that the overwhelming majority of the projects for which we see applications, we have seen in the past, are actually going to fall into the Category 1 projects. Therefore, we are only talking about just a general highway safety analysis and no detailed guardrail assessment. Again, this is, I guess, the first thing to do to determine what type of safety analysis is needed is to first figure out whether it's going to be a Category 1 project or Category 2 project. Again, if you look at the link that we have attached in this slide, you can get into the detailed definition of the different types of projects, different types of safety analysis, what's the general safety analysis, and what is a detailed guardrail assessment. So we have all those detailed in this documentation, attached documentation here. But to simply state, unless your pavement, resulting pavement surface is going to change the surface of the pavement that would result in a net elevation change of 2 inches or more, it's going to be a Category 1 project, and the only requirement is to conduct a windshield daytime observation, and then also, what involves in that windshield daytime observation and the form that's associated with that observation and how that needs to be filled out. Again, those are documented in this link here. We have placed the document on our website for you to access and take a look at it. Again, this is an agreement that FHWA and VDOT reached back in 2017. It has been slightly updated in 2018, and you will be able to see the most up-to-date version when you click on this link that's attached here. Again, I just touched some very high-level stuff here. If you have any detailed questions about the windshield assessment, the daytime windshield assessment, and what's included in the general safety assessment, please take a look at the document first, and then if you have any further questions, we'd be happy to answer those questions at that point. But I think, as Todd mentioned, and some other speakers also mentioned it beforehand, the key is to get to this, well ahead of the deadline. That way, we are not addressing or dealing with these issues, at a date that's very close to the deadline.
Okay, does anybody have questions regarding the safety analysis? Okay, I'm going to move on to the last slide of our presentation. At the September 17th CTB meeting, VDOT proposed to increase the time allowed to advertise segments from 6 months to 12 months and increase the funding limit per locality from $1 million to $1.5 million. The call for applications will be sent October 1st, and at that time, we'll also provide the list of eligible projects. We anticipate the CTB to adopt the updated policy, federalizing primary extension projects at their October 17th action meeting. In anticipation of the policy update, the SMART portal has been updated to accept applications up to $1.5 million. If the CTB should oppose the $1.5 million recommended increase for some reason, the SMART portal will be updated to limit funding to the original $1 million. The CTB action will be communicated to as soon as possible after we learn of the CTB's outcome. So there are several changes in the SMART portal that I need to mention. So in addition to checking the maintenance of effort certification box, there will also be a federal box to check to acknowledge projects will be developed as federal and the funding is federal. And also, beginning this year, we're going to require a project cost estimate that has to be uploaded to the SMART portal. The application period ends December 17th at 5 p.m., and we ask that you please submit your application as early as you possibly can, so if there are any issues that can be resolved prior to the deadline.
All right. Again, continue to put your questions in the chat box. I did want to point out again, to reiterate that if, prior to applying for either a SGR bridge or paving project, we ask that you coordinate with your local liaison to make sure that, one, we know who's going to administer, the project, make sure we're capturing who's going to do NEPA, et cetera, and to make sure that we're capturing any VDOT oversight cost or VDOT service cost, because that does need to be included in your request for funds for either the bridge and paving program. We did get a question whether or not the SGR bridge is on the same schedule. Yes, both pavement and bridges are on the schedule. October 1st for call for applications with a closing on December 13th. Also, one thing that we've been talking about as a group is we were going to put together, for those projects that are selected, those paving projects that are selected for funding, we will put together a one-page key checklist to verify some of the items that will need to be submitted for federally funded projects. It kind of goes along with what Tanvir had mentioned about the roadway safety analysis. We will have some type of checkbox verifying that you have conducted one, depending on the type of work that you're proposing. Also, any environmental work that needs to be done, we'll have a checklist again to kind of go through that and provide that to you all. So we'll have that again after the application cycle closes. We'll make sure we have a form to get out to you for those selected paving projects. All right, so it looks like we're getting some questions in. Is the public involvement process for federal projects required for SGR paving as the process/funding has been federalized? And again, not that we're aware of. We will put together some helpful hints. Also, we're putting together a frequently asked question document that we will share with groups along with the information that we have today. So we'll be sharing that with you. I will say that the locally administered projects manual will need to be followed for federally funded projects. So you just want to take a look at that and make sure that you're adhering to all of the required documentation information. But we will clarify whether or not public involvement process is required for a.
And I think there's an exception for paving that does not require any right-of-way, even for UMEC, this will be not.
Yep. All right, next question is for application/estimate purposes, can we get a copy of VDOT's line item rates since we won't have a federal contract yet?
So we've had those discussions especially with the stakeholders group. The there for your, you know, you can dial into, you know, your district and maybe, I mean, obviously not your locality per se, but adjacent, areas. But, the one thing that I had made mention of in the stakeholders group was we procure probably 98%, 99% of our paving, we procure federal aid. Even if we don't have federal money, we're doing it just in case. we get federal monies and we can flip the switch. The other 1% we do with state funds that don't require the federal dollars, and the reality is we don't see a price difference. But to that point, we're procuring much greater volume, you know, on the order of $400 to $450 million worth of, you know, thin treatments all the way through plant mix projects. So I don't know that our numbers are good numbers for you to use from a budgeting perspective or estimating perspective, because there's a lot of other things that we do with we offer incentives and stuff for material components that are on top of that base unit price. So I don't think, I would shy you away from using our numbers. I don't know what y'all's numbers are looking like, but it's probably not all that far off of what you're currently seeing.
Thank you. Another question, will the statewide allocation be increased to cover the increase in locality application limit? No, I mean, I don't know if we mentioned.
But we are getting a larger influx of money going forward.
Correct. The SGR program will be fully implemented beginning in FY21, so there will be additional allocations that will be included with the SGR program. However, you know, the CTV formula funding will sunset, so we're not sure what the difference in total allocations will be. We do not have budget numbers as of today. All right, question, will VDOT provide any type of contract template for federalizing SGR paving projects? Yes, we're going to provide that on our website, something that you all could use and you know, preparing your primary extension contract. Any other questions? All right, not seeing any, we'll stay online for a couple more minutes. If you have any questions, please just go ahead and put that in the chat box. Again, we'll follow up this webinar with a copy of the PowerPoint recording of the webinar and frequently asked question list. Thank you.